Trump's raid in Venezuela, his open threats across the hemisphere, wars grinding on, the steady rise of authoritarian regimes, and protest movements shaking every corner of the world and defying the status quo. Feeling like international politics doesn't make any sense anymore? No worries. Our 2026 geopolitical outlook will put you back on top of what's happening in the world. Hello and welcome to another episode of Warrior Diplomacy. Today I am joined by my fellow co-hosts Valeria and Fabio. How are you guys doing?
Hi, Aramis. I'm doing really well. It's great to finally have an episode, the three of us together. I feel like it's been a while, and also such an important one because we're 2 weeks into the year, and it already feels like there's so much to catch up on, and so many things to make sense of. So hopefully, we will leave this episode with ideas a little bit clearer in our mind.
Hello to both of you and everyone listening. I think that the beginning of the year is always a nice time of the year to reflect a bit where the world is heading. But one thing that I always think about at this moment of the year is that in international politics, the new year, new me doesn't really apply, right? Like the trends that we see the previous year do follow into the new one. So in order to address this, we think that the best way to structure this episode would be to separate it into three main blocks. In the first one, we'll do a review of the key figures that shaped last year. Who were those winners, those losers, and those disruptors? Then in the second block, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into what last year revealed, like those three big geopolitical structural trends that we've identified that we think that marked last year and definitely will mark 2026. And then in the last block, we're going to go in depth into this year, who we think is better adjusting to this world where rules and the international order isn't really making sense anymore.
Then I would say let's get straight into it and start off with the people that we've nominated last year for the winner, loser, and disruptor of the year.
So as I was saying, I think that the dynamics that we saw in 2025 don't really reset every January, right? Like they actually hardened. So before really analyzing 2026, it's important to ask a simple question. What did 2025 reveal about power, right? And who holds power? Political figures. So last year, we asked our audience in Instagram to help us choose who we thought would be the winners, the losers, and the disruptors of 2025. So I think it's time to check to see how those choices hold up and what they tell us about the system itself. So the three candidates that we decided on last year for the winner of 2025, we said it would be Lula da Silva from Brazil, Donald Trump from the USA, and Giorgia Meloni from Italy. Our audience selected Donald Trump, and indeed, I think that he did earn the title of the winner of 2025, not really because he restored the international order, quite the opposite. And I think that he proved something really unsettling, that raw leverage beats international norms. And I think that in 2025, Trump showed that unpredictability isn't a flaw. It's actually a really important and strong bargaining strategy. He also showed that threats can replace negotiations and that allies need to adapt to power, not principles. So I would say, Armis Valeria, that he didn't really win politically. He really won the inside logic of the system that now exists. And yeah, I agree. I think that Trump was the winner of last year and arguably the winner of the system. What about yourself, guys? Do you think that Trump indeed was the winner of last year?
In my opinion, he's only a winner in the short run because this is the nature of what happens when you break with the rules-based order. It gives you some short-term wins. We see this with the US now getting better access to raw materials, better trade deals. But it also means that everyone will lose in the long run. You have global supply chains that are being disrupted because there's no more predictability. This leads to more costs. You have business certainty that is being harmed. And we also see armed conflicts on the rise across the world, leading to more costs. And the US is becoming less attractive as an ally. Look at Europe, for example. which is their most important ally, arguably, they're diversifying away from the US, working on trade deals all around the world. Now we have the big trade deal with the Latin American countries, Mercosur coming in. We have Indian trade deal coming in, and many more. And then let's also consider the tariffs. They are one of Trump's main assets on the international stage to coerce his way through. But they are also hurting the US economy. We're only seeing that they're starting to bite, but inflation is already rising in the US, and it's becoming a major issue in driving Trump's approval ratings downwards, which then again creates the risk that he will lose his majority in the Congress and will lose massive power. And then when we look at the overall state of the US economy, it's not looking too good. We see that there is indeed some growth, but this growth is driven by AI-related companies that may be sitting on a bubble. We don't know, but there are very prominent concerns around cash just going out at some point, and another similar bubble compared to what we've seen with the dot-com bubble at the start of this millennia. And without those AI companies, the US economy would be in a recession right now. So it's a very difficult situation, and I think it will only get worse for Trump in his presidency going forward.
I completely agree with that. I think he was the winner within the system or the environment that we have seen over 2025, but that his win will come with some structural caveats, because the reality is that 2026, as much as we're going to continue to see some of the trends, is also going to be a different playing field in which his leverage and strength and the ways in which he has shaped the international order is also adapting to him and to these new trends. So allies, as Aramis mentioned, are learning to treat American unpredictability as a permanent condition. The supply chains are diversifying, trade partnerships are hedging, and a strategic dependence on Washington is just no longer assumed to be safe in the same way. So I think that could very much change his role in 2026. I mean, there's Venezuela, which of course they have this long-term plan, but there's a lot of questions remaining about it. And I mean, in the podcast that you did on it yesterday, Fabio, in Spanish, you mentioned that it was not about regime change, it was about regime management. And regime management requires a lot of energy, and it's not something that you can really get done, move on, get a new front, in this case, for example, Greenland, right? There's, of course, he's talking about potentially intervening in Iran. There's the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which we still have a lot of things that need to happen this year. Tensions between Israel and Gaza, and what is the future of Palestine going to be? So, I mean, the fronts just are a lot of them, and it's very unclear how he's going to manage all of that while he has the midterms coming up in November. There's a lot at stake for him. His ratings are dropping. As Aramis mentioned, there's a lot of questions about the economy. It's unclear if he can afford that position and at the same time secure his majority in the Senate and in Congress. The way I see it, he has a dilemma, right? Like whether he continues to capitalize on the moment that he has and the fact that now he has control and he is exercising his executive power and taking more unilateral action, or he instead decides to focus on maintaining that control for the next 2 years by focusing more on domestic issues and making sure that the U.S. electorate continue to support him. So I don't know. I mean, the elections are in November. It seems very far from now, but the reality is that everything that he's doing right now will have an impact in it. And then just on the term of the midterms, I think I want to clarify that there's a lot of expectations on what the midterms are going to bring. And I certainly think that if Democrats were to secure a majority in Congress and in the Senate, they will have a lot more leverage. I think we would see that have more of an impact on the domestic level than on the foreign policy, because the way the government works in the U.S., the president always holds a lot of the foreign policy agenda, so to speak. So, I mean, we've seen, I think, something major. It was last week, Congress tried to pass a bill to restrain the Trump administration from carrying out military action in Venezuela without Congress approval. This was vetoed in the Senate, but it's just a way to see what kind of action we could see if he loses the majority in the midterms, and in fact, Democrats have some sort of obstacles that they can put into this foreign policy, right? So a lot of questions about what 2026 will bring for him. He definitely managed to overcome obstacles in 2025 very well, but we will see about 2026.
Wow. Not much to add, Valeria and Aramis. I think you really set up the stage really well. I think most of what happens in the global stage, what happens in Washington has a big impact, right? So definitely those things are to have in the radar. But I'd like to ask you, Aramis, about the other two candidates we had, both Lula da Silva and Meloni. They had great years as well, politically speaking. Maybe not as good as Trump in that general sense, but they also had good stuff to talk about. So anything to add for this first category?
I fully agree. It has been a good year for Meloni, especially if we consider that across the world, leaders struggle to maintain their popularity. And Meloni has yet another year where her approval ratings are stable in Italy. And especially in Italy, this is remarkable because there are few countries in the world where the government is changing as often as in Italy. And I want to talk a bit more about Brazilian President Lula because I think his case is even more remarkable. He was in quite a difficult situation this year because he was confronted with a 50% tariff by Donald Trump for the handling of former President Jair Bolsonaro. Trump didn't like the fact that the Brazilian Supreme Court was cracking down on him, and so he imposed those sanctions, and he also imposed sanctions on a Brazilian Supreme Court judge. But instead of crumbling under the political pressure, like arguably we've seen with the European Union, with other actors in Southeast Asia, Lula fought back. And he used those tariffs for his own political gains to strengthen his position in Brazil. He didn't negotiate a quick deal to get out of it, but he stand firm. And in November last year, Trump started rolling back those tariffs, and Trump even removed the sanctions of the Supreme Court judge. So this was a clear policy win for Lula. Another win for him is that he was able to implement his agenda of opening new markets. Here, I have to highlight again the Mercosur trade agreement, which is now at the final stretch. In March, the European Parliament has to approve the deal. Getting the majority here won't be straightforward, but it seems like that it will happen. And Lula also delivered on one of his central other campaign promises, which was to lift Brazilians out of poverty. Remember that the previous president, Jair Bolsonaro, he cut down a lot of programs that help poor people, and Lula turned them back on. And between 2023 and 2024, more than 8 million people were lifted out of poverty, and 2 million people escaped extreme poverty. And now Brazil will have presidential elections later this year, and Lula is widely considered to be the favorite to win. And here the interesting thing is that we have incumbent left-wing leaders across the world struggling to get approval ratings. So for left-wing leaders, this is even more the case in the world. And Lula is one of the cases that shows that left-wing politics can still win over majorities in the public. It's still possible to rule with stable popularity. Maybe two moments that were not as successful as anticipated for Lula this year was the BRICS and COP summit, since they didn't really deliver very significant solutions.
No, definitely another huge political winner of the year. And I also see Lula, how he's trying to become that voice of the global South, or at least of the Latin American region, which is a region more geopolitically relevant lately more than other years, right? So definitely I think he was a big winner of the year. But now when we jump into the next category, the loser of the year, last year we had three candidates. Emmanuel Macron from France, the Iranian regime led by Ayatollah Khamenei, and Vladimir Putin. I think that the three of them had some political and geopolitical setbacks across the year. The audience pick was Emmanuel Macron, but I think that the deeper structural loser of 2025 was the Iranian regime. And here's why. First point, I would say that its regional proxies were significantly degraded after the confrontations with Israel. The internal legitimacy of the regime also eroded way, way further. And thirdly, and really important, the nuclear deterrence is truly questioned, right? After those U.S. and Israeli attacks to the nuclear centers and its scientists. So I think that how and the way that the Iranian regime is now trying to hold on power, it's with a lot of repression. That it used to be a really strong guarantee of control, but now it's also producing diminishing results. And we see that with the protests that haven't really toppled the regime, and I am not even sure if they will. But they just really talk about the expulsion of this system, right? It looks really brittle and reactive. So how it goes further, it's something maybe we'll address in the next section. But I truly believe that Iran was one of those big losers of last year and probably this year as well.
It's quite remarkable how the Iranian regime manages to stay in power over and over again. I mean, we've seen protests across the decades, really big protests popping up. I remember a few years ago, people were already saying the Iranian regime is done. This will not work. And this year we had commentators saying the same thing all over again. Yet the protests have calmed down. But on the other hand, the regime is facing the structural issues. The economy is really in a horrible shape. In Iran, we really see that sanctions do work and they do have a significant impact. It's perfectly highlighting how it just takes a long time. So we've seen it for many years, and it's really dragging down the economy. So Fabio, interesting indeed to see how this will move on. I wanted to comment on our last year's nomination of Vladimir Putin, which was someone whom I have nominated as the loser of the year. And I have to confess that I was wrong. I thought that his economy would crumble under the massive pressure of the war. I mean, we have interest rates that are still staggering high at 16%, which means that the non-war economy can barely access any capital, meaning very limited non-war private investments. We see that the costs of labor are massively up as men are dying in the war instead of working. And sanctions are increasing the costs of imports and decreasing the value of exports. Remember that Russia has to buy stuff via third countries, and it has to sell its fossil fuels, which is a major source of revenue, at a steep discount. But the thing is that Russia prepared for all of this. They have been building up a massive war chest of foreign currency reserves to keep the ruble stable. And by spending a lot of money on the war, they eventually also invest into their broader economy, making up for the decline in other sectors such as real estate. And like in Iran, I think that the sanctions will bite. The Russian economy will suffer if the current trend continues. But first, the Russians have to run out either of people or of money. And it doesn't look like they will in this year either. Russia is losing hundreds of thousands of men every year, but they can still recruit more soldiers than the Ukrainians. Experts say it takes 6 years for the sanctions to bite. When that happens, we can see the consequences in Venezuela and in Iran, but not in Russia yet. And very exciting to look ahead at what's happening here also on the war in Ukraine. We have all those negotiations and people hoping maybe it will end soon. There will be a deal soon. But I rather have the feeling like Putin is trying to just drag this one out more and more because he's still thinking that he can make some gains on the ground.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Aramis. He was also the one I thought would be the loser of the year. And as you mentioned, I mean, I don't have anything to add to that, but he's certainly been able to navigate the 2025 international order in a much better way than we anticipated. Okay, so with that, I think we can move on to who was the disruptor of 2025. The candidates that we had were Elon Musk, Senegal President Diomaye, and Viktor Orban. So the audience chose Musk, and I think in a limited sense they were right. It's hard to see it right now because he certainly has lost a lot of his influence over the last months of the year. But I mean, if we go back to the beginning of the Trump administration, he certainly was a disruptor. He may not have been the architect of it. He was a player within the Trump administration, but he was a symptom of it. He held a lot of power. He was very influential in the online ecosystem and in the information ecosystem. He was very loud, but then at the end of the day, he proved that he was disposable, according to the Trump administration. His early dismissal from Trump's second administration revealed a key truth of 2025, and it's that even the biggest private actors hit a ceiling when states decide to enforce it. I mean, he donated so much money to the Trump administration. He held a very powerful position, but at the end of the day, he was disposable. And his tensions with Trump may have been relieved to a certain degree over the past months, that we have seen a little bit more of an interaction between them, but he certainly has lost that status that he held. So it's certainly a lesson that other tech titans in Silicon Valley have learned, as we have seen in the way that they more recently interact with the Trump administration. They are looking more to accommodate interests and to avoid confrontation. They have significantly increased their political donations and positioned themselves in agreement with the Republican Party in a way that was not public before. They've also kept more of a quiet public profile and adjusted their positions on regulation. So maybe that's also something that made him a disruptor, the fact that he may not have changed policy outcomes, but he did clarify the hierarchy of power and made evident that some of these changes, on the international stage. And also, of course, while we're with Musk, we have to mention that as the head of Doge and with some of the cuts that he made in U.S. spending, he was the leader, but he was not he was leading those changes, but he was not the one exclusively responsible for them, but he completely deprioritized foreign aid agencies and programs, like USAID is the most well-known. By doing that, he weakened US soft power. He disrupted very key partnerships for the US, and he's contributed to leaving tremendous gaps for other states to fill across the world. So I think all those things really make him the disruptor of 2025. What about you guys? What do you think?
Yeah, I fully agree. If we look at the tech sector more broadly, it's quite remarkable how powerful they are. From a European perspective, US tech companies, they have huge control over our payment systems. They control our biggest social media platforms. They also get so much of our data through many other means. For example, now increasingly through artificial intelligence. So they have really become a major player, and them being so loyal to the White House also means that they are quite an asset for the Trump administration. I wanted to move on to the two other candidates that we covered for the Disruptor of the Year. Last year, we nominated Senegal's President Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who had at the time quite recently emerged as Senegal's leader from a surprising election victory win. Diomaye promised to boost Pan-Africanism, fight corruption, and strengthen the economy. He did not bring about the huge change promised in the end. His reform effects are overall limited. For example, Diomaye excluded himself from a high-level anti-corruption law. So that's not the best optics. And on foreign policy, he achieved a few victories. Most notably, Senegal was elected to lead ECOWAS, which is the economic community of Western African states, a very significant force in the region. And Senegal will assume presidency until 2030. And especially since previous months, we experience increased government infighting in Senegal, which is also preventing real progress. And then I wanted to cover Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, because it actually turned out to be quite a difficult year for him. And that's even though at the international stage, things were looking quite good. You have Trump, of course, a major Orban ally, assuming office in the White House. In Czechia, Andrej Babiš became prime minister, another Orban ally. And this means that Orban almost got his Visegrad group back, because in Slovakia, Prime Minister Robert Fico he already assumed office in 2023, another Orban ally. And the Visegrad group, this was a very significant power, a very significant bloc within the European Union in the 2010s, shaping policy quite substantially. And we are seeing that this bloc of Orban allies is already exercising more weight than it used to in previous years. But on the other hand, they're not as powerful as they used to be. For example, in the past, they would rather threaten to block EU action with their veto. And now in the recent Ukrainian loan deal, we saw that they instead decided to opt out and let the other EU members decide on how to move forward. This is also another sign that other countries have learned to deal with those more disruptive far-right politicians. And then Orban's relation with Trump did not go as well as anticipated. For example, after Orban visited the White House last November, he said that he would get a $10 to $20 billion of financial support from the US, only to have Trump later saying that he's actually not getting it. And Orban would have really needed this money because the Hungarian economy is in a very bad shape. According to some metrics, it's the poorest economy in the entire European Union. And this is one of many reasons, especially next to high-level corruption case, why the Orban government is perhaps as unpopular as never before. And after more than 15 years in power, Orban is set to lose this year's federal elections, which will take place in April. He's polling more than 10% behind pro-European candidate Peter Magyar. So very exciting to see how the Orban era will drag on, whether he will be able to make a turnaround here.
Amazing, guys. I think that we covered different figures of different regions of the world, and that already starts to give us a picture of how things moved around last year and where things could move in the coming one. Well, in this one, I suggest let's jump into the second block and talk about those three big trends that we've identified for international politics. So let me go straight into the first trend that I see reflected everywhere, which is the one of economic disruption. And that means when the economic interdependence of the system starts becoming a weapon of coercion. And I'm not only talking about tariffs or protectionism. This is a shift that goes beyond. I mean, every single economic tool in the arsenal starts to become an openly coercive tool to use. Without the old diplomatic wrapping, no? And what's different now is the sanctions are less about changing behavior. I think they're more now about imposing costs on allies and rivals in the same sense. Trade, energy, access to markets are also being used to punish and as a tool of leverage. And economic pain is increasingly being accepted as collateral damage, even by democratic states. I think that Trump definitely accelerated these trends. With his threats replacing negotiations, with all this uncertainty that's becoming a bargaining tool. And when alliances are treated like variables and not constants. So I totally see how the economic field is not a neutral terrain anymore. And it's one of those big trends changing how politics move. What do you think, Valeria, from the U.S. There in Washington, in New York? What's your angle?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the key shift that we have seen is the intent. So economic coercion in 2025 wasn't just the failure of diplomacy as it would have been in the past, but it was the strategy in itself. They weren't tools to protect domestic industry or to correct any trade imbalances. They were actually used to extract concessions. And we have seen that in the way that President Trump has done it to get concessions from Mexico and Canada, for example, or to signal strength and assert a certain political stand. So, for example, more recently, Trump has threatened to impose 25% tariffs on any country that trades with Iran. So in that way, it's becoming a tool that is different. It's used in all these different ways, and these threats are also issued before the negotiations many times, and then the criteria for the removal of the tariffs is also very vague, and in many cases, complying with that criteria doesn't guarantee the relief that the countries are seeking. So that is the uncertainty that it creates, and that uncertainty is the goal in itself. And once economic tools are used in this way, it's not simply that they are punishing the target in particular that they are going after, but they are reshaping the incentives and the international order according to it. So states are learning to diversify and to regionalize, which is, I mean, something we had a whole episode on these. The new economics power, which we will leave in the link section, but that is the way in which it's shaping the international order. And worth noting too that even though we often point to President Trump on these, he did not invent this logic, but he has completely normalized it. He leverages uncertainty and unpredictability as a bargaining tool like nobody else. And to a certain degree, he is even normalizing it among his own allies.
Valeria, those are great points, and I do refer anybody listening to check that episode on the new economics of power, which is a great episode we had with a guest from India, which had a really particular perspective. So anyone interested in this particular trend, that's the episode to check. The second trend that I see across the world is the one about democracy. I think that democracy is under strain. And we are seeing the increase of authoritarian methods and the normalization of these authoritarian methods. I think this is a trend that should not really be framed as simple as democracy is losing. I think it's way more complex than that. We should maybe frame this issue as the democratic legitimacy is being hollowed out from within. And I think that in 2025, the system showed that democracy still exists, that's for sure, but a lot of constraints are weakening. And we can see that in emergency use of powers, in the concentration of power as well in certain offices, in certain branches of government, and security arguments being used as excuses to consolidate even more and more power. We are also seeing how voters all over the world are starting to tolerate illiberal measures as long as they promise stability, maybe economic stability, maybe security stability. And we also see authoritarian tactics are no longer exclusive to authoritarian regimes. I think that some of the trends that we see in the U.S. definitely call into this trend. And finally, we can see how surveillance, repression, disinformation, and legal pressure are starting to become more constant. So I think that in this trend, we can see how both two candidates of the loser of the year, Emmanuel Macron in France, and the Iranian regimes, and why we think they're losers of last year, it becomes really illustrative. In the case of Macron, I think that he lost a lot of authority because the democratic tools in France really slowed down his decision-making process. And in the case of Iran, maybe we can say that the regime has lost a lot of power because the repression system doesn't longer guarantee control over its citizens. So overall, I think this is an important trend as well to have in the radar.
Absolutely, Fabio. That's definitely been a big trend of 2025. And I think it's been difficult to make sense because the erosion of democratic rule doesn't look in the way that we all anticipated. In some ways, it looks legal, democracy is increasingly judged not by the procedure, but by the performance of it. And I think the big question is, does it deliver on the demands of the public? And voters have not abandoned democracy, but they have reprioritized it. And we're seeing a lot of countries where they have one thing that they want to change in their country, and they will put that ahead of whether that change happens within the democratic establishment and following democratic rules. And once that problem is solved, there's a lot of questions that arise about what comes next. But for now, we are seeing a lot of voters thinking in those terms. And
I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think the US is such an illuminating case to show this, because we have Trump backrolling against all those democratic institutions. Yet when you ask the voters on their opinions and why they may approve or disapprove of Trump, the main metric that they look at is the economy. So democracy as a value is apparently being less treated as a priority by voters.
absolutely, Aramis. And I often think about this. When I think about this, I often come to the case of El Salvador and Bukele, and how the priority there was security and everything else came after. And now that security has been fulfilled, there's a question about what is going to be next, and how are voters going to continue to justify having Bukele as a leader if their main concern was already addressed. So yeah, I completely agree. And just to add here that this year, I mean, it's not going to be such a big election year as 2024 was, but we're going to see key elections. In February, we have elections in Thailand and in Bangladesh. April in Hungary and Peru. May, we have elections in Colombia, which are going to be big ones. And the polls are showing that Gustavo Petro is very likely to lose power. In June, elections in Korea, Armenia, Ethiopia. In October, elections in Brazil, as we mentioned. And then in November, of course, the midterm elections in the US. So we will see if this trend continues to follow through in these elections, or if we get some surprises.
Absolutely. And if anybody would like to go in depth into this topic, we have an episode named Can Democracy Survive the 21st Century? I think it's a really interesting episode to check. We go and we analyze the situation in El Salvador. Actually, the guest of this episode is from El Salvador. So really interesting episode to check to go further down this second trend. But if I may go to the last trend and how I see that international politics are moving, is this theory of spheres of influence and the collusion among the big powers. And from my perspective, I think this might be one of the most important trends to underline where the international system is moving. And the way that this is defined is a shift from open competition within rules to maybe a world where negotiation over space, control, and territory can be managed between the big powers, right? You respect other big powers' spheres of influence. So how does this system look like, you may ask? Great powers act fast, they talk later. There's tacit understandings about replacing actual formal agreements. And we can see this reflected in Trump's actions in Venezuela, or his new national strategy considering the hemisphere as a sphere of influence of the U.S. And we can see this as well with his rhetoric on Greenland and the pressure he's imposing on Panama as well. I think this pretty much illustrates that angle. If we think about international alliances, I don't think that this means that they will disappear, but maybe they will become way more transactional. And we can totally see that the way Trump's approaching NATO and its European allies. Of course, there's dangers in this system. Maybe different rivals, different powers are learning to coexist in this ambiguity. But in the absence of direct clashes between major powers doesn't really mean that there is stability. Maybe it reflects that there is collusion through restraint. But when one actor tolerates some limited transgressions by others to protect its own freedoms elsewhere, maybe the system doesn't mean there's going to be an immediate conflict, but maybe there's going to be a gradual erosion. And maybe as spheres of influence they harden, smaller states, smaller countries really lose room for maneuver. right? Institutions become bypassed and conflicts might become even harder to resolve because they are embedded in great power understandings rather than international law. And I think that this is the way that the system is moving. Again, I think we have a really interesting episode that goes in depth into this trend. It's called The New Age of Power Competition, Deals and Dominance, and our guest goes and explains this trend even more than I could in this section.
If we look at the world, we see that we have those imperialist powers, which is the US, Russia, arguably to a certain extent also China, and then we have weaker countries where it's not clear who they are aligned with, and in those countries you have potentially conflicts erupting, and like you say, those conflicts it will be now much harder to resolve them based on international law because you have these great powers that have interests and do not want them to be resolved in a certain way, and I think this will make the world a much less secure place, and this is a trend that we need to have on the radar.
All right, so jumping into our last block of today, we've already addressed some key figures and some key trends that mark 2025. I think that we already have a good sense of how 2026 will most likely look like. But why don't we go a little bit further and actually start to analyze who do we think is better adjusted to adapt to a world where rules matter less and less. So if 2025 showed us how the system works, I think that 2026 will show us who can actually operate inside it. And I think this is not just about morality or legitimacy. Again, it's about adaptation. So, chicos, who do you think would be interesting candidates for the winner of 2026, the one that will adjust the better to this new setting?
Xi Jinping is obviously in a good position, being an authoritarian leader who is not restricted by other powers within the country. China is not particularly booming right now, economically speaking. The economy is facing significant pressures. We have low growth, we have stagnation, and we have an increasing amount of countries that are increasingly reluctant to import Chinese goods because they are feeling like that they are not operating on a level playing field and are being increasingly dominated by the Chinese economy, threatening domestic industries. And predictability in general has become such an asset. So for Xi Jinping, this could really play out well. He can really double down on his long-term strategic posture. But I think the other aspect is that there is also the inherent weakness of authoritarian regime. Yes, Xi Jinping can decide on a very concrete way, but the question is whether this way forward is really the right way. And what we discussed in our episode on China's political and economic weaknesses is that China is right now in the middle of an economic gamble, I think we could say, because they have massively invested into their own economy. They have accumulated massive debt, and now they have all these companies that are leading in industry and in technology. But the question is whether they will later be able to translate this leadership into actual economic output. And this means that they have to sell their goods across the world for the decades to come, dominate all these supply chains. And as I've said, it remains to be seen if the countries do want to accept that. And with the current economic pressures, we're really seeing that China is in not an easy situation and really forced to sell their goods at a mass scale. They, in contrast to most other countries, their economy is not so much shaped by imports. They're quite independent of anything out there. But their dependence is on exports. They really need this export success, and whether they will be able to achieve this will be defining going forward. And the Trump administration is doing quite a lot here. Trump is trying to impose tariffs on countries that trade with China. Trump is trying to restrict the access on chips, even though he has backtracked on that a bit and gave NVIDIA some some better access rules here. And so it remains to be seen how China will be able to navigate here. So much on China. Fabio, why don't we look at another place in the world? What about Latin America?
Arbis, I think that Xi Jinping is definitely a good candidate to be a winner of this year. He profits a lot from Trump's unpredictability and maybe some erratic action, no, and showing a bit more constraint and calmness can actually benefit his position, right? But if we talk about different regions and who I think would really get some huge political wins this year, is the different set of Latin American hard right leaders. And again, I don't think it's just a matter of winning elections, but it's more about this story of outperforming voter exhaustion. And here across the region, I see voters prioritizing, as we've said before, control over chaos, sovereignty over openness, and security over democratic norms. We saw in Chile's election a couple months ago this shift. Valeria talked about the couple big elections to come this year. Colombia will fall into the right side of the political spectrum, I think. And Peru as well, they may follow. So now we have Argentina, Uruguay, El Salvador, Ecuador, and Honduras. The list keeps growing. Brazil remains uncertain, as Aramis, you've mentioned, after Bolsonaro's attempted coup and his legal reckoning. He might not be able to put the right together in Brazil. But again, I think that this trend is not just about the right winning in Latin America. It's about democracy becoming more transactional and certain leaders better adjusting to this. So if you add, in addition to this, that Trump and the way that he's approaching the region will be more present, and this personalist, this populist, and this confrontational model of power being more present, maybe these leaders will be able to, not just directly and politically align with Trump, but have more preeminence in the way they approach their specific countries. So if we see this, we could say anti-communist, anti-left-wing international sharing tactics and ideology, as we've seen this last year between Milei, between Bukele and Daniel Noboa from Ecuador, maybe their connections and their political stance will be even stronger in 2026. So that would be my suggestion. I wouldn't say just one leader, but I think that the right in Latin America will be a big winner of this 2026.
I completely agree, Fabio. And if I may just add, when we were talking about winners of 2025, someone that came to mind for me was Javier Milei in Argentina. He certainly was not the winner of 2025, but certainly did really well for himself. He won critical midterm elections. He secured $20 billion financial lifeline from the United States. As you said, he became a key ally of the administration. And then after that came Jose Antonio Cast's victory in Chile, which also signaled that he will have a key partner in the region. And I think what this victory from 2025 tells us is that this trend that you're talking about, it's becoming bigger, and he definitely signaled that there is a place for these far-right figures in Latin America to position themselves with the Trump administration, the benefits that they may get from it. So certainly a trend that we are going to be watching in 2026, as there will be key elections, and especially I know the rise of the far right is a concern for Colombia in particular.
On the other hand, if I may jump in here, if we see that the Trump administration is increasingly becoming coercive in Latin America, going beyond Venezuela, but now also attacking potentially Mexico on land, maybe an invasion of Cuba, who knows? These are the ideas that are being floated around by the administration. Then we could potentially see this whole strategy backfiring, U.S. approval going down, and then those leaders that have previously identified themselves with the White House administration suffering from that. And we are seeing this already play out in Europe. Lots of far-right leaders that now have to distance themselves from Donald Trump, which have previously been allies of him. Most notably, we saw Jordan Bardella, who is set to become the next French president. His party is leading in the polls. He deeply criticized Trump's approach in Venezuela. There has been a survey among far-right parties in Europe whether they think that the White House administration is good for their country. And we saw that aside from Romania and Hungary, far-right parties in most other European countries, there was no majority among the electorate which thought that the White House was good. Again, this is not the entire country, but the far-right parties that are supposedly allied with Trump.
And just to add to that, Aramis, I think we may see those positions and that backlash against the Trump administration harden if the midterms don't go in the way Trump wants. Because at the end of the day, as we said, it's becoming a more transactional international stage. And in that transactional approach, whether Trump is doing well or not will determine whether people align with his stances or not. So yes, certainly something to watch out. It's difficult to talk about winners when we can anticipate that there's going to be backlash on the other side, for sure.
Indeed, Valeria, that calls about the difficulty of selecting someone that we think might win or not. So sometimes it might be easier to select trends, right? But I think both are really interesting angles. And Arm is interesting that you mentioned Bardella and France in general, another country that we might find with elections. Not sure if 2026, but definitely 2027. And I would not be surprised of the far right arriving to Paris in a couple or this year. We'll see. If we jump to...
You're right. Sorry, Fabio. Before we jump to the next category, you're absolutely right. We need to mention this aspect because Bardella and his party, the Rassemblement National, they may emerge as the disruptor of this year because they have a quite negative stance towards the European Union. If they manage to win the elections, this could really have significant impact on Europe. Maybe this whole notion of European policy, European power, maybe it will absolutely deteriorate and it will only be nation states fighting for themselves because one of the biggest powers within the European Union will be trying to manipulate any progress at European level.
No, absolutely, Aramis. And if we can present maybe Latin American hard-right leaders as potential winners of the next year, we can totally think of far-right or further to the right leaders in Europe as potential disruptors of the year to come as well. And if we jump into that category, if I may, I have two suggestions, two candidates I would like to put in there. And both are great power leaders, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I would not say one or the other would be winners or losers, but both will be definitely disruptors as well. In the case of Putin, he's sitting in a complicated gray zone. He's not winning, he's not losing in the Ukrainian conflict, but he's adapting, right? He's prolonging the conflict, betting on political fatigue in Europe and in the US, and as well exploring the fragmentation of the political priorities of the continent. So I think that this makes him and his approach really dangerous, maybe not dominant, but definitely disruptive. And if we think of Trump, same, he might win, he might lose power during the next elections in the US, but he's definitely changing the way the system operates, though. So forcing everyone else to recalibrate. And this means what we've said across the episode, spheres of influence, transactional alliances, and erosion of red lines. So maybe Trump will win, maybe he will not, but he will definitely continue to disrupt the whole system.
Yes, I agree, Fabio. I think in particular the role of Putin as a disruptor is a very interesting one because it's one thing that we continue to see year after year. But the way in which he's holding on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and the negotiations have not paved the way that internationally we were hoping. I think it will definitely continue to be a trend in 2026. But I think maybe we can move to loser of the year. I know we have quite a few nominations here. I think I would start with saying that I think Nicolás Maduro is the obvious pick here. I mean, he was taken to New York for trial in January 3rd, so that is a very, very early nomination for loser of the year, I would say. His downfall wasn't just personal. It exposed how brittle his regime was when it came to external protection that completely evaporated. I mean, his ties to China and Russia just did not exist when it came to safeguarding his regime. His internal loyalty is transactional. His legitimacy has long been exhausted, as we all knew. So I think this case will echo well beyond Latin America, and it's a warning to other regimes that survive by inertia rather than by adaptability. And I think one of the other reasons that would make Maduro a good candidate for this category is not just the fact that he was arrested by the U.S., but the way in which he was arrested so seamlessly and the regime sort of moved without him. I mean, the members of his candidate are still there, showing that the structure and the loyalty that he was expecting no longer is there. Diosdado Cabello, Padrino Lopez, and Delcy Rodriguez are part of this new interim government. They've moved forward without him, and in the end, it just goes to show that he was a lot weaker than he thought. What about you guys? Who do you think fits in this category for 2026?
Another obvious pick is the Iranian regime. Obviously, we've discussed this, the economic issues that it's facing, the political pressure, and then going on, one could mention Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We could say that last year was quite a successful year for him. Israel has really established itself as the dominant power in the Middle East. It could launch attacks without facing any repercussions. And it has really been able to double down on its relation in the White House. But now, especially towards the end of the year, we've increasingly seen also reluctance from the White House to really fully support Israel's agenda, because the American public is tired of supporting wars abroad. And also a sign of Netanyahu's declining power is that now when we're discussing about a potential second very big strike in Iran by the Trump administration, we don't really hear Netanyahu a lot in these past weeks, really trying to make Trump do the strike. Apparently, the White House administration has told him to keep a rather low profile here. Could also be in their own interest to not delegitimize the protests in Iran. But on the other hand, maybe the strikes will still happen. That's still in the air. But Netanyahu still faces a tough time. He has to face accountability for what has happened after October 7th, whether the Israeli security situation is really improved. He has to deal with increased domestic polarization, and his political coalition is increasingly eroding. Remember, you have all kinds of far-right factions in the coalition, but that have very different goals, some of them religious, some of them rather nationalist. And his recent security success, if you frame them as those, they do not guarantee his political survival. Fabio, do you have one more final candidate for the loser of the year?
Definitely. Both the three options we've said so far, I think they're great candidates. I would add one more, and that would be the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and maybe international institutions as a whole, as losers of the year. I mean, we know it's Guterres last year as Secretary General. We'll most likely have a new one. We will have a new one in 2027, that's for sure. Question is who? I think Michelle Bachelet from Chile is the potential top candidate there. But I think that if we think of the UN and international institutions, more than a collapse of the system, it's just the irrelevance. We see that in every single conflict erupting in the world, and these institutions no longer being able to adapt to this system, right? They exist, the norms are still there, but their power is increasingly moving around them, not through them. And leaders no longer pretend they even matter, right? So when the international institutions are being bypassed and not reformed, I think that that definitely tells us something is happening, and I would totally think of them as one of the losers to come I think they lost a lot of significance last year, and it's gonna continue being the case next year.
Yeah, those were all very interesting candidates for losers of 2026. I think it is interesting that all these figures, as ideologically different as they are all in this category because they relied on something that no longer delivers in the current international stage. So whether it's Maduro relying on external protection and security forces and a repression apparatus, Iran depending on weakened proxies and also tremendous international repression, Netanyahu relying on U.S. backing and coalition politics, or the UN relying on member state consensus and trust. These are all things that are they don't longer hold the same weight than they did. And they simply have proof that they haven't adapted quickly enough to the new pressures. So I think it just is not just about who the candidates are, but what the trend between all of them is and what it tells us about what 2026 is going to bring. This was a great episode, great way to summarize the year. I think we have a lot of hypotheses in here and a lot of questions that we will continue to answer throughout the year. I don't know if you guys have anything else to ask.
Same, nothing much to add more than thank you, Valeria Aramis. It was a great episode, I agree. So much to cover. I mean, it's truly, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's a big challenge to talk about everything that, how the year will play and different predictions. So I think that we managed to go around the world and set the stage. I think more episodes will come along the year that will go more in depth and we'll actually see how things develop. But I think it was a great exercise to just see how the world is being shaped, how trends are moving, and an interesting dynamic as well with the winner, loser, and disruptor. I think that it really paints an interesting picture with good examples of how things are moving. So looking forward, guys, to continue analyzing this next to you in the coming months.